Here we are. We're coming to the end of the season of Easter. We are awaiting the time of Pentecost. In today's reading, the word Spirit comes for the first time sort of into our lectionary readings as we go along this lectionary journey. Most of you will understand that each week we have what are called lectionary readings. They are set readings. They're not ones that I sit down and think, what shall we preach this week? Often the lectionary is preached in churches around the world, the same lectionary. So when we read these things, we know that other churches in their times of worship may be sharing the same scriptures. There's something comforting in that as well, isn't there? That we are not just feasting around the word as a small organisation, but as a much bigger group. And there are seasons, and we go through the different season, and every season has its shade. We are in the season of Easter, which is, do you know what colour the season of Easter is? White. Good. Fantastic. We're all on this. Oh, that's because it's white up here. I know, it's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? And it's white down here. It is a bit of a giveaway. But we take these things for granted, don't we? And I did ask myself, where is the lectionary going in all of this? Because we've been through the Easter story, and I thought perhaps we should do a little bit of a recap. We had Resurrection Sunday, which is the first Sunday of Easter. Do you remember? When we all come together, we all feel good about it because we've just had the Maundy Thursday service. We've had the Good Friday service, which is always pretty sort of heavy and clouded. And then we come to the Easter Sunday service, which is hopefully pretty good. But then we get into the question of who is this person that's been resurrected? And how have they been resurrected? Because as we've seen in studying it, the three of the Gospels are pretty much singing the same song right up until you get to the resurrection. And when you get to the resurrection, they all seem to go off in their own direction. Luke tells stories of meeting a man on the road to the place called Emmaus. You know that story? Yeah. That's a Luke story. It's not in any of the other Gospels. You come to the end of Mark, you're all standing, staring into the empty tomb. Nothing more, and just someone there saying, he's gone. That's the ending of the book of Mark. The ending of Matthew is a little bit different again. We get some interesting stories in Matthew, but it finishes up with them all standing on the Mount of Olives and Jesus going up into the air and giving the Great Commission. Go into the world, making disciples, baptizing them in my name, etc., etc. And we have some very weird things in there. Do you remember how the disciples responded when the women came and said that Jesus was risen again? They didn't believe, did they? And then we heard a story of a man called Thomas, who was the doubter, but just doubted a bit later than the first lot of doubters. And then we've learnt the story last week about how Jesus comes and talks to his disciples before he's crucified. So we go back in time. It's like Back to the Future. You know that film? We go forward and then we go back. It's wonderful what you can do with the scripture. And there you are sitting there and we look at this part where Jesus says to love one another. But we're also told in that there's revelation, to make revealed. I have come to glorify the Father, and in glorifying the Father, I'm glorified. You will see the Son of Man glorified, all those sorts of things. And then finally, you will glorify me by how? By loving one another. Whew, that's the story so far. And I'm tired. Because what does it all mean? There's a question of identity. And that's what I was starting to talk to the young people about. Firstly, the identity of the risen Christ. Who is this risen Christ? And we have different stories of resurrection. And the reason I believe we have the different stories is because for each one of us here, resurrection might mean different things as well. Because it's about what we experience. Resurrection is not something of 2,000 years ago, but resurrection is what happens in our own lives. And for each one of us, there's a different story. So there's no wonder that at the end of each of these Gospels, it goes into a different realm. Resurrection is real, but it takes place in different places on the road to Emmaus, in a locked room, in a garden. All of these stories are different and in different places, but for us, resurrection can be different because we experience life differently, don't we? My experience from your experience may be totally different. We do have shared experiences, as we've said. Many of us have come from overseas. And so coming from overseas, we share an experience of being new people and to struggle for our identity and to understand who we are, whether we are one thing or another. And sometimes we clash the both together. We struggle for identity in many other ways, and I talked about this a little last week, in terms of, what does it mean to identify yourself as Bob the Builder, for example. Not you, Bob the Builder, but it could be Bob the Builder, couldn't it? Yeah? But what it means to identify yourself through what you do. And what happens when you stop doing that? Do you stop having identity? But really it comes down to, and I'm going to have to truncate what I say because our time's getting away from us, but how do we identify ourselves in light of resurrection? As this congregation here, as this people that meet in this place, within this community, here and today, how do we identify ourselves? Well, we've done a little bit of that thinking. Can you maybe give me some words that we might identify the Springvale Uniting Church by? Hospitality, multicultural, and welcoming, barbecuing. Thank you, Bob. Welcoming. That's one way. How else can we identify ourselves? How do you identify this congregation? Caring. I'm going to open it up because, hey, this is not my sermon, it's your sermon as well. How else will you identify ourselves? Friendships, long-lasting and good friendships, that's a good thing, isn't it? Peaceful congregation. Well, most of the time we are. I'll tell you about the other stuff like, no, not at all. What else? What makes us this congregation? We're good neighbours. I think we're a pretty hard-working congregation. There always seems to be something happening here, whether it's through the op shop, whether it's through the men's shed, whether it's seeing Trevor and Bob running around frantically fixing up everything for us and keeping the place looking good. But, this is an incredibly hard-working congregation. We are an accepting congregation, aren't we? I loved it when we had the two people from Cambodia here last week and they were sharing their story. And I thought, we're part of this story. Isn't that fantastic? When we heard of that young girl and how her life had changed. We are part of that story, not just for her, but for all of those kids in Green Gecko, in Siem Reap. So, yeah, what other ways would you like to describe yourself? I'm actually going to turn this in a minute, so be careful. Any other things that we'd like to say about ourselves before I count 3 and bang the hammer and pull the gable down? Generous? I think we're pretty generous. My experience is this is a generous congregation. I've been in a few and not all of them are so generous. The next question is much a harder question. Sorry, John?
Are we hopeful?
Are we hopeful, congregation? I was going to say I'm hopeful every time the pay comes in, but no. Yeah, I think we are a hopeful congregation. We struggle, like all congregations, as we see the relevance of church in our community diminishing. When we see our numbers dissipating through age, through having to move, through changes in society. I mean, Sunday used to be a holy day, didn't it? People very rarely worked. I'm not going to say no one worked on Sundays because they did, but, Sundays was a day where we came together often. And many of you can think back to days of large Sunday schools, to active congregations. We are not in that boat now, are we? Sadly. There are large congregations, but by and large, Sunday is just like any other day. And the word holiday, has taken on different meanings. I must say, again, getting back to footy, I love the way that they now produce the footy. It's as if it's a religious experience in themselves. They speak in hushed tones, and they will meet at the MCG. Two teams coming together, Titans. And it's, and you have your preachers. They're the ones that come on beforehand and explain to you what's happening in the footy, because you can't tell what's happening through watching it yourself. And they explain it. And, the great gift of redemption is if your team wins. And we sing the song. Isn't it funny? They hate singing songs. But at the end of it, if you sing the footy song, it's okay. But you ask them, what do you do at church? Oh, we sing hymns together. Oh, that's a bit odd. Yeah, but often this sport thing in Australia especially has this religious connotation. And you look at them, it's like this big build-up. Fantastic. You can have all you want. Follow your footy team, as long as it's not Hawthorn this week, I should say. That sort of thing. We are creating substitutes. But it then asks, how would we be perceived by our community? We know what we are, don't we? We've said all these words. But how are we perceived by the people outside of here? There are some that will have connections with us through OpShop, through Men's Shed, through some of the things that we do, the outreaches, the garage sales. But sadly, by and large, for many, we are invisible. Yeah? And that's sad, isn't it? And I believe, and I will say, that the church is becoming more and more invisible as the years go by. I watched with interest on Monday Q&A. Did any of you see Q&A on Monday, where they had a Christian panel of 4 or 5 people on there? 5 I think it was. And it wasn't watching the panel because obviously in these sorts of things they try and be as controversial. So you put someone with one opposing view to someone else with a different opposing view, and you try to get them to devour each other on television. It's the new form of gladiatorial complex, where they're fighting. But what I was interested in is the tweets that go on underneath. And by and large, they were very unflattering of people's view of the church. I think the first tweet was, why do we have to listen to this group of people that believe in this fairy story? I don't believe it's a fairy story, because I believe that the person of Jesus, God, resurrection can actually make changes and make differences to people's life. And before I want to get onto the Spirit, because that's coming up when we get to Pentecost, which again is perhaps not as black and white as we would like to think of it, but I would like to say I think that the story we have is relevant. And the hymns we sing aren't relevant. Maybe to us they are, because I love singing some of those old Wesley hymns. The Wesley hymns, How Great Thou Art, I like them, Mary. I'm sorry, I do. They're good hymns. How Great Thou Art, not Wesley. Well, it isn't, you're right too. But the Wesley ones. My chains fell off my... when you're in a room full of people just belting that out, it's pretty powerful. It is pretty amazing. But, it really doesn't matter, those songs, does it? Because that's not the character of who we are. The character of who we are is what we've said. Loving, caring for one another, wanting to please God, being hopeful. In a world where there is no hope, isn't it great to be people of hope? Yeah? Big challenge. So the question today is, before we get into the Spirit coming and taking us and making us do all these exotic type of things, let's think of what Jesus has called us to be. A people of love, a people of compassion, a people of justice, a people of mercy, and go out and feel good about yourselves, because you have been called to be part of that story. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And even when I don't like myself, do you remember last week I said there are times when I stand in the mirror and I can barely recognise myself, because I'd love to see that young 22-year-old bloke looking back at me with curly hair, slim, fit. I had a six-pack because I played hockey and I played soccer. I was a bit of a rooster, I've got to be honest. But he doesn't stare back at me anymore, and I don't always feel too good about that. Now, I know you ladies are fine because you can colour your hair and look great, but, we all struggle with that, don't we? But you are something. You are special people. As we sung earlier, God has chosen us in this place to be the people of God. And wherever we might find ourselves, we are the people of God, the followers of the Christ, children of the Most High. That's a pretty amazing thing to think about. And even when we might struggle with all of those things in ourselves, it is the truth. And the truth is what it is. Amen.